Hi, I'm Dave Sherwood, the CEO of Bibliu. I'm here to introduce you to Campus Convos, the podcast where we discuss all things tech and education. Hope you enjoy it. Please subscribe on wherever you listen to your podcasts, and please give a share to others interested in the space.
So to kick things off, Tuesday, obviously, having been president 10 years, you've seen quite a lot of change. What do you think are the most exciting things, maybe in terms of technology, but also in terms of like other trends impacting higher education right now?
So I do think technology is a big trend that is exciting in higher ed. The innovation around technology has been exciting. So obviously everybody's talking about AI recently, and I will say that landscape, I believe, will continue to change because, there's a lot of startup companies around AI. So I feel like over time that will get more mature. There'll be fewer AI companies, but they will be more advanced in what they can offer higher ed. So I'm looking forward to that evolution and what that could do for higher ed. I'm also excited about the possibility of lifting even more transactional work off of students and staff so that they both can focus on that higher level thinking and critical thinking, strategic thinking, versus trying to navigate, for instance, how to get into school, how to figure out where everything is at a college or university. And for the staff in the same regard, to not, have to work around transactional items, but to have deep, meaningful conversations with students that really forward their journey and path. I'm also looking forward to technology consolidating, although it's good and bad, because that consolidation process when you're bought and sold is very rough for higher ed. I'm hopeful, though, that on the other end of that means more robust, more engaging technological solutions for higher ed that don't require as much maintenance and that are more intuitive to use for all parties.
And in terms of that sort of M&A environment, have you personally experienced any major suppliers being bought by others and merged in? And was that a difficult experience, or were there benefits in the short and longer term?
So from just my perspective over the years, not just at Westmoreland, but at other places I've worked, when a company is purchased, it tends to not be smooth transition. What I've seen is that engagement from the company falls off. Technological advances tend to come to a stop. As the companies, I'm assuming, are trying to, merge behind the scenes and figure out what technology they're going to use, what staff they're going to have. It's very, very impactful to higher ed, and it tends not to go well. So again, in my experience, it takes a few years before you start to see innovation and re-engagement from that new merged technology company. I really feel like technology is light on having people from higher ed in it to help them navigate a recent merger and to understand what needs to take place as they're engaging and innovating into the higher ed space. I feel like it would go a lot smoother if they had that kind of expertise.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Not one that I've really heard much about or talked to others much about. I think everyone knows in any sector M&A is often difficult, and particularly for the customer partner, that those are pretty common things to have. But it's not something that's been raised much. But I'm sure, to your point, as the market consolidates more, and we're seeing, particularly in spaces like learning management systems that have been around a long time, we are seeing more consolidation. So it'll be really interesting to see over the coming years what that looks like. Also, where we are in terms of venture capital is not where it was. So that means many companies, particularly in EdTech, will be forced to be part of mergers and acquisitions that maybe they would have remained independent longer had, interest rates remained lower and capital remained a bit more easily available. And what about on the institutional side? We see, I think, particularly, small private colleges sort of folding at almost an unprecedented rate. And in the private sector, generally, you'd see more consolidation, M&A, where a company's in distress, a stronger company in the same space will step in and ensure there's a more smooth kind of transition. And ideally, in the case of a college, ensure that specific geography, or maybe it's not geography, maybe it's like a discipline speciality, remains offered. And so like going forward, if you live in that area or you're really interested in that specific discipline, you can still get that course. But do you think we'll see more, I guess, sort of M&A in the institutional space, particularly when they're distressed? I know that obviously the dynamics are different because we're talking about not-for-profit institutions by and large.
So Pennsylvania is a perfect example of the M&A happening. So there have been quite a few mergers, but there also have been quite a few closures. Higher ed was overbuilt for the population that exists today and for the sentiments around higher education today. So it does need to right size. However, to your point, some of the largest at-risk institutions are also sitting in a space that without them would be an higher educational desert.
Yeah.
Particularly around rural areas. And so then you really do get to, the point of whose problem is that? Who props up those institutions if they need to be, so that rural communities are not disparately, situated. I don't believe I've heard of solutions around that, at least in the United States. And so it will be an interesting kind of trend to watch moving forward. States are really not able to fund higher education to the same degree that they did when higher education was really booming as a sector. And so is it a public good or is it a private good? And who pays, for that education? And so I think until that is solved and agreed to, we might see more closures and unfortunately more areas that don't have access to higher education like some other areas in the United States.
And it's such a shame. I actually grew up in a rural part of Australia, and like the US, similar challenges. Not me personally, I was quite fortunate, but typically educational outcomes are worse, like health outcomes are worse, socioeconomic outcomes are worse. It's just, all these things we hear about in terms of Rust Belt being left behind and stuff like this. And sometimes that includes cities that are in more rural places as well. They're just further away from the big booming cities in a particular country. And it's such a shame because, as you say, the local community college or university, depending, it can be a big factor, both in terms of employing people and actually creating good jobs in the area, but also helping the community, become more productive and move forward socioeconomically. And if you take that away, it's a big hit both to the economy, but also to like the future of the economy. It's like, how is that group of people there going to ever train to move forward? And so it Pennsylvania, a really interesting point that you're saying some of these institutions are merging or being absorbed by others, and others are unfortunately closing. What determines which ones close and which ones are merged into others?
So what I have seen is that some colleges or universities, their boards are more receptive to coming together and merging. It's a difficult process. And we mentioned in EdTech, it's not smooth. Well, in higher ed, it's not smooth either. And there's not a lot of experience in higher ed on merging institutions. So you really need to have your boards look at this as, we're not giving up something. It is us coming together so we can keep our institution and our community and be stronger on the other side. So, and then all of those other layers of the community accepting that and what have you. So some institutions are also, because they have waited until they are really on the door of closing before they look to merge, and then they're less attractive to another institution And, in many cases, rightfully so, because perhaps they don't have any reserves. They have expenses over revenue. They have they have a long deferred maintenance list for, their equipment and buildings and technology and what have you. So by the time they're ready to talk about merging, it's become so onerous that another institution can't do that because they don't have the resources to do it. So it's really a lot of factors that come in play. And for a board to go into a conversation about merging when you are still strong, because that's when you're at a position of power, right, to come together with another institution, I believe has been difficult for people to face, because you're still in a position where you are solvent and you are still making things work, and so they want to continue to try to make it work versus talking about mergers.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Obviously in the corporate space, there are quite a lot of incentives for boards and management to merge. People have shares that they can sell to one another, and if you're CEO or chair of the board, just because you merge, that can benefit you quite a lot, and it can be seen on a CV as a good thing. Obviously, in a not-for-profit environment, those incentives aren't there. So I sort of wonder how. And to your point, it's not just incentives; it's partly about also support and a bit the mindset, but definitely support. Like, there's not a lot of expertise. Whereas again, in the just general free market space, there's loads of companies that can help, that you just pay and they come and integrate the companies, or they find a buyer, or they find a seller, all these kind of things. So yeah, I wonder what sort of things the state could do, or potentially at the federal level, to create the right incentives, but also support and mindset. Yeah, because ultimately it strikes me as like it feels a bit random as to which ones survive and which ones don't. There's not a lot of rhyme and reason to it. And it's a real shame, particularly like we said, a lot of these colleges are supporting, the communities most in need. And it would be great if by default, if things are heading south, there's a pretty quick path for them to merge into another group so that we're not losing them left, right, and center. Yeah. So, is there anything you think the state or the federal level could do to create better incentives for these structures and more support as well?
Certainly, right. Everybody says, money, infuse money. But, I think to your point, you also have the talent to make this work. And so if there were companies that could help make the mergers happen, perhaps have the conversations with the boards of these institutions to explain to them when is the opportune time to do it, how you do it, being able to lead the way. I do think that would be helpful. I'm not sure it would be enough, because these institutions are seen as economic engines in their community. So there could be some fallout to that. Whereas, a company, especially if they're remote, like a technology company, they don't have that roots in the community in the same way. And they don't employ the people who you see at the grocery store and, at the gym and what have you. So there's a lot of emotional attachment to it as well. And I'm not sure, other than, again, having expertise to lead the college or university through this, I don't know how you would create that different dynamic.
And it seems like, assuming if we take a particular college and financially they're losing a lot of money or something like this, for them to merge and for it to work, you'd need a bigger institution to not only plug that gap financially a bit, which they may be a bit more reticent to do, but also ensure that the large majority of jobs and obviously the campus stays in play. And maybe there's some middle ground where they keep most of the jobs and most of the campuses, but not others. But I don't know, it's a really tricky one. Then politically, you've got the hot potato of, if state support, federal support, or even sort of local political support is to be gained, I don't think the politicians really want to get involved in these sort of things where, one specific group of people in a geography feels disadvantaged and another might feel the same way if it's their area potentially subsidizing. So it's a really tricky one, but I do hope we see something put into place soon, and particularly just sort of like a standard process or mechanism whereby if a certain threshold of financial loss is hit, unsustainability, there's a sort of almost like a bidding process where, it's sent out to the entire group of higher ed, this school is in trouble. If anyone is interested in merging and taking on, obviously the expectation is they take on the people and they take on the campus. Let's run through a process, because it just feels like there's not even a process right now. And actually, the UK is exactly the same. There's no when a school is in trouble, there's no process, no government support. So at least have a process to run through, and maybe at the end of the process, everyone decides, look, that the local community doesn't want to merge, or there's no appetite for others to be the bigger party, then maybe it doesn't work. But yeah, and so interested to know what else you've seen over the sort of past decade in terms of change, particularly your area, because everyone talks about, the Rust Belt all the time, particularly in a political context, how important it is to, winning elections, and almost like the US psyche and how people in the US are feeling as to whether things are getting better or worse. But how have things changed there from the perspective of higher ed? Obviously, we've touched on some colleges having difficult financial times. What else has changed?
So I would say just overall, and not even specifically to the Rust Belt outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Higher ed, I speak to my colleagues a great deal about coming into the job over a decade ago and now. It's completely changed. The dynamic around being a president of a college or university is nothing like it was a decade ago. The expectation that you wear every single hat and your breadth of knowledge is extensive, it's an expectation, an almost unrealistic expectation that you know how to deal with all the various constituents, that you meet their needs. Some of those are conflicting, that you be great at finance, that you be great at fundraising, that you understand academics, that you are politically aware and astute and can navigate all of that. It's hard to be good at everything. And the good part of technology that we talked about before has also laid itself at the doorstep of most administrators and presidents as well. And that is the expectation you get back to people almost immediately. And so, if you get something night before and you don't answer till the next morning, it's like, where were you? And so it's hard to let down. It's hard to come off of, being on 24/7 and what that might look like. We've seen this play out even at the elite universities. They come out on one side of an issue and 50% of the people are unhappy. You come out on the other side of the issue and the other 50% of the people are unhappy. So, we're seeing a lot more vote of no confidence against presidents. We're seeing shorter tenures of presidents. It's becoming an increasingly difficult position, and I would say all of administration, top administration in higher ed. As far as the question about geographically where I'm situated, it is, while it's outside of Pittsburgh, it's considered rural America. So other than Pittsburgh out here in the West, it really is rural America. And so with that, it's aging. It's declining population. It comes with its own set of, challenges when you are in higher ed. So having to navigate that and get very entrepreneurial, rethink about how to get revenue while still being true to your mission, still serving. If you're a community college in Pennsylvania, you have support locally, so you also have geographic boundaries that you have to be sensitive to since you have local support. And that has changed. But I will say this past year, enrollment did rebound for most community colleges. I don't think they're back to pre-COVID levels, but there's a little bit of a light. But you and I both know there's also the demographic cliff and across the nation. So we'll see what that looks like in the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's such my role is much simpler because I have less stakeholders. I've got my team, I've got our partners, the universities, the publishers, and shareholders, investors. It's much simpler, but people look at like a CEO president role and they're like, oh, that would be fun. You have a lot of power and prestige and, all these things. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of benefits to the role and I wouldn't change it. But often you are just brokering compromises between different stakeholders and you can never please everyone. And it is difficult. I think much more difficult for you whilst you're a college president, when you have faculty unions and the local politics, and in the current environment too, where things are getting increasingly political, like in Florida, we hear about the governor appointing the college president, so that becoming effectively a political appointment, which is sort of unprecedented, really. In terms of the different stakeholders, I guess it's a unionized state, so the faculty generally unionized.
Yeah, staff typically are also unionized, Dave. Yeah.
Yep. I hadn't thought of that aspect. So you've got the faculty unionized, and you've got the other staff as well unionized. And the board, is it elected? Is it a political board?
So in Pennsylvania, every state is different. I've worked in a variety of different ways the board comes on, but in Pennsylvania, there's two ways basically. And that is they are either appointed by your county commissioners, if that is who sponsors you locally, or by your school boards, if that's who sponsors you locally. So typically, again, that does tend to be political, because all of those tend to be political, positions that are appointing to your board.
In Westmoreland, because I guess the state itself is purple, but in a rural area, it's probably red. So it was
Yes.
Republican boards. That's super interesting. And are there any independent board members that aren't political? Well, I guess you are now as like sort of an advisor, but maybe not a formal board member.
I am not a board member, right? So I don't know all of the affiliations of all the board members. I will say I believe Westmoreland has been really, really fortunate that a majority of the board is there for the right reason, regardless of their political affiliation or personal feelings and thoughts. They want to see the college be successful. There are other circumstances where board members may not, come in with that lens. And because the board has 6-year terms and they are staggered, in essence, every 2 years, you are potentially getting new board members if those are not reappointed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one of the benefits that seems to be a result of political appointees to boards as well is tuition fees are kept held low. And I know that could be a big challenge for the president and the college, but I don't know, what is a typical credit hour cost at Westmoreland for a student?
So if you look at Pennsylvania overall, you will see that it is ranked some of the most expensive college and universities to attend, largely correlated to the public support of higher ed in Pennsylvania, whether that be at the state or local level. It's also of the 50 states, it's somewhere around 47 to 49. It kind of fluctuates there. So there's a direct correlation. So there have been a lot of conversations and efforts on how to make education in Pennsylvania more affordable. I know when I was down in Texas, it was probably a third of the cost.
Wow.
To attend a community college. And so, yeah, it's still the most inexpensive. Community colleges are still the most inexpensive college in the state. But relatively speaking, when you look at a majority of other states, it is significantly more. And certainly universities too.
Yeah, I did not know it was like 3 times. I guess the broad point I was angling to, often people in the general public don't understand that community college tuition is still, often very reasonably priced. And the idea of super expensive tuition is certain bigger 4-year schools, particularly some private ones. And so 3 times more expensive than, say, Texas. And what difference does that make? Because I assume that means your budget is larger, or maybe less people attend. Like, how does it... what is the difference of having a 3 times higher fee?
Yeah, so the budget's not larger because the other sources of funding are not there. So that's to offset the other sources of funding. So it actually is relatively comparable as an overall budget. It's just your sources of revenue are different when you look at it in like a pie.
So in Texas, there's more coming from like local taxes in the state?
In the state. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fine. But
Yes.
like the cost of education per student is similar, but the cost to the student directly is higher. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you're from quite an interesting background, right? Because you've been in the private sector for quite a while before you became president, which I guess is probably more unusual than not. How was that experience for you, like coming in to higher ed, and why did you make the move?
So I didn't even understand community colleges when I was approached by the president of the local community college, and he asked me if I wanted to apply for the job. I really came in very naive about the role community colleges play in higher ed. You know, when I came up in the community I grew up in, literally you went to the best school you could get into. That was the goal. But saying that, because I started out in banking, worked in manufacturing, and then got into higher ed, I've not regretted it for even a moment. And I've certainly not regretted being in the community college space. I feel like community colleges do the most good with what they have. They meet people where they are and they get them to where they need to be. It's much easier to attract, retain, and teach people if they're all sitting sort of in that same incoming preparedness. But when I came into higher ed, it was not popular to be business oriented and private sector oriented. And actually, it was very difficult for me to make the transition. I recall at my first year contract said if I left, I had to repay my contract. And I thought, how very strange, I'm not leaving. But I understood why the president did that, because he knew my transition would be difficult. I'd not worked in a shared governance environment. I'm like, look, if your boss tells you to do this, like, you do it or you leave.
Yeah.
You don't get to argue about how we're not going to do that. I will tell you the other change now, it has really benefited me to have an MBA in accounting, to come from, the private sector and to understand that, because as much as we may not want to admit it, higher ed has become more of a business. Being the president is about people and money, which is the same role that you have, Dave, in the private sector. And so it's actually really, I believe, benefited me and the organizations I've served to have that. But that is very different from what it was when I came in. It was almost entirely, you came up the academic side to get into higher management.
Yeah, I think the sector could do with more people like yourself, Tuesday, that come in with a different view. That applies to lots of industries. I think people in EdTech are guilty of mostly hiring from, a lot of people being hired from publishers or institutions or EdTech and not looking elsewhere. But yeah, it's an interesting one. It must be quite difficult for those coming from the academic side that haven't learned about P&Ls and haven't learned about, other corporate things. And so what do you think the biggest learnings you could bring from your corporate experience to higher ed were? And you touched on some of them, but then in reverse, like assuming at some point you spend more time in the corporate space going forward, I know you've been doing some advisory, like board type roles. What do you think you've learned from being inside the community college that could be applied to management of other companies?
This has been quite the journey over what's been almost a year. I was looking to get into adjacent work to higher ed, in particular around perhaps EdTech. What I have realized is EdTech hires the exact same way higher ed does. And I'm not even sure I realized we did it in higher ed until I've been, on outside of it. And we hire somebody who's already done the job that we're looking for. Exactly. We don't look at transferable skills. We don't look at people that might have a different background, but still have applicable skills. We do this in higher ed. Have you sat in the vice president of academia role for 10 years? Great, we'll look at you, right? Have you been a vice president of, success at EdTech? Okay, well, we'll look at you. But if you're somebody like me, again, who sees higher ed, who knows how to speak higher ed, who knows what they're looking for, that has actually not been a skill that is seen as beneficial outside of higher ed. But again, higher ed's guilty of it too. So it's been an interesting journey for me to see how I feel like higher ed could benefit from different industries, similar skill sets. Perhaps you have to learn the language. And I think EdTech could benefit from looking at higher ed, professionals, and not just salespeople, but, senior leaders,
Yeah.
and maybe even a CEO, because you have a different skill set. There is a learning curve no matter what, but eventually it all evens out in a year or two because you've learned, the tech stack, and you've learned, the PE or the, VC language and what have you. But it's been interesting, and I'm feeling like I need to have a greater impact on both worlds and looking at this differently. I just haven't figured out how to carry that message.
It's such a good point. We've also found that sometimes inexperience is a good thing. Not a good thing, but some of the best hires we've made have had inexperience. So you've got different skills that are useful, or transferable skills that are useful, but from a different sector or different role. But also sometimes just taking a punt on someone that's like, a bit earlier in their career and hasn't got the experience, but has some of the attributes that you can see in an interview, or perhaps they've worked at a more junior level, can work really well. I often say to people, I think just in general, people get way too wrapped up in experience and, like you say, very specific experience. I always say to them, everyone has experience, and particularly anyone that's been in a career for a while has a lot of experience, but we all know that there are a lot of people that aren't highly competent. So you shouldn't assume experience means competence. But it's so hard to and we have to constantly remind people when we're training managers in recruitment, you don't use experience as a trump card, like specific experience, because in reality, competence is more tied to that individual, how hard they work, how they think, how they work with each other, their people skills, rather than a CV. Because everyone that's been working a while has a CV, and a lot of people who've been working a while aren't great, just like a lot of people are great. So it's an interesting one. I don't know why people, I don't know, it's a human nature thing, but the more organizations that can think a bit outside the box with hiring, I think the better. So Tuesday, I've really enjoyed having you on today. Hopefully get the chance to catch up before too long as well in person. And just want to remind the listeners as well, thanks obviously for joining us today. And please subscribe and put in a review wherever you're listening to this, whether it be YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever. But yeah, appreciate your time today, Tuesday, and looking forward to catching up.